Hey everyone, this is Shaman from Rocketship HQ, the mobile user acquisition firm that lets you grow in a capital efficient manner. Our guest today is Sharath Kowligi, the Director of Ad Monetization at GameHouse and advisor to Rocketship HQ. Sharath works on improving monetization and yield for a portfolio of over 35 apps. And no, that is not a typo. Sharath has an incredible wealth of experience both on monetization as well as user acquisition and growth. In the past, he managed user acquisition and growth for Bash Gaming, where he worked alongside me. Bash Gaming was acquired for 170 million. Sharath also worked for Pretty Simple and has advised many companies on different aspects of their growth. Something that Sharath's done an incredible amount of work on has been in App Store testing. He has run over 200 App Store conversion experiments, and that's what I'm excited to dive into with him today. I'm very excited to welcome Sharath Kowligi to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Sharath, welcome to the show.
Hi, Shaman. Good to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you because I've seen so much of your magic from close up, and I've always admired both the mix of creativity and analysis that you always bring to the table. And so I'm excited to dig into a lot of your magic in a lot more detail. Also, because you run like 200 plus App Store tests, and this is certainly something that I want to dig into more about. So, to take a step back, why is App Store conversion testing important? And why do you think most apps don't do this?
Well, I mean, when you look back to, you and I, of course, worked together for years way back in what seems like a past life. And when you look at why we didn't do it back then, it was mainly because we couldn't.
Yeah.
And when you look at a lot of folks who are currently running UA or growth, a lot of them have memories of that, where tracking this stuff is just not possible in some cases and not straightforward in other cases. And frankly, on iOS, it's still quite tricky to really test properly. Whereas on Google now, it is possible. And I think the reason that adoption has been so difficult, especially in, let's say, the gaming space, where I primarily operate in, it's because iOS has often had such an outsized impact on revenues. So it's always been, oh, okay, we have this thing, but we don't have it in iOS, and iOS is our most important platform. And Google keeps changing these things and has been improving these things, in my opinion. It hasn't been, backward and forward. It's always been more data, more granularity, a better identification of specific conversions throughout the funnel. And I think mainly it's been the reason for low adoption, in my opinion, is that because it was only really, and even now, only really available on one platform without using a third party solution between. And of course, it's critical now because of two different reasons. I think one, because even if you have, one major platform out of two that has this information, it's still hugely valuable.
Yeah.
Just optimizing Google. The other part about it is that the Google Play Store has become so much more important for everybody than, let's say, where it was 5 years ago, for sure, because the rate of growth for most folks on the Google Play Store has been phenomenal when compared to Apple. And that this has always been the case in terms of downloads and the number of users, but now also in revenue.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. And I would also imagine way back 6, 7, 8 years ago when you and I were working on this, it was somewhat relatively easy to get installed at the time. There wasn't as much competitive pressure as well, which absolutely has changed since that time. And so let's assume there's an app that's like, right, we need to start testing. We'll listen to Sharath on this amazing interview. We need to start testing. Where do you recommend they start, assuming they've never done any testing before with their App Store pages?
Yeah, I think that's fair. A while ago, almost 7 years ago, when we were working on this, the store was a whole lot less crowded, or when we started working on this. Um, and now, if you were to really start from 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 scratch, let's say, I think it's pretty clear that visuals are where it's at. I don't think there's anyone who's gonna say no. Let's test copy first. It breaks my heart to say it, but I don't think,
Mhm,
because I got started in advertising as a copywriter at one point, and it breaks my heart to say that copy doesn't move as much as a copywriter would like to think it does,
mhm,
at least in the basic testing. There's a lot of evidence that shows on the App Store, especially in the Google Store, the thing to look for and the thing to change is really the big giant thumbnail for the video and the
mhm,
icon. Those are the two big things that you want to change.
mhm.
Certainly, it's really easy, I think, to say, oh, this is super new and this hasn't been the way that it's always been or anything. But visuals have always been the big critical thing uh, in advertising. Like there are entire companies that
Mhm.
build careers around good packaging, right? And the App Store really is just good packaging for your app. And when you think about it that way, and you go back to kind of the first principles of advertising, make it attention seeking. Can anybody look at this thing and say what it is
Yeah.
and get excited about it? Like, is this different? Is this the same? And that same but different, that's what people are really looking for. They want to be able to understand what it is, but it should also be new and interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is really what one can achieve with a good amount of thinking around the icon, a good amount of testing around the video thumbnail or what used to be the feature graphic on Google.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say new and interesting, are there examples of tests you've run where you've employed this that come to mind?
Oh, for sure. Like my favorite example is this example of this doctor app that we worked on. Um, and that was this game called Hearts Medicine. And the value of that test was just huge because that was one of the first tests that we ran that had an impact. Until this time, we were doing 2%, 3%, 5%, nothing. Like essentially, the confidence levels at 90%, the differences were very little. But what I mean by the same but different, or old and classic but still new, it was really in this one icon. So it was a doctor game, and we had an icon that everybody agreed on. We had the first ever consensus where the creative team, the branding team, and the performance team looked at an icon, and it was about a doctor's story. She goes from a medical intern to a gifted surgeon, and the icon was a doctor holding a stethoscope, which makes tons of sense. And there's a big background of a heart behind her, and her name is Heart. We thought that was super cool. And then everybody agreed that that was a great thing to do. But then the art director on the actual game, who was not part of the marketing team per se, he had this classic portrait that he had drawn almost as an in joke. It was kind of like this Milton Boone cover, or this. Well, it wasn't actually Milton Boone. It was more like an 18th century painting from called Kosovo Girl. It was about a nurse in a battlefield helping a soldier.
Mhm,
And when we looked at that icon, we were like, this is terrible. No one's going to like this. This is not the game at all. This is horrible. This
mhm,
is, you're turning it into some random romantic novel when this is a very serious game and all of those things. And then when we
mhm,
tested it, it knocked it out of the park. It took, I think, 3 or 4 days for the results to come back from Google. And it was easily at least 40% better than this consensus candidate where everybody said it was great.
mhm,
And,
mhm,
and you look back over the literature of A/B testing, um, whether it's stuff that was written 100 years ago in scientific advertising, or what Ogilvy wrote 50 years ago, it is that A/B testing does, when done right, or when you get a little bit lucky, whichever one you choose, it makes a huge difference. And this thing really made a huge difference. It changed our advertising for that game. It changed how we thought about games and stories. It changed the top of the funnel, and we could see that it was actually having an impact further down because the kind of expectations that were set at this point onwards
Hmm.
was pretty solid. And
Yeah.
I think that's my favorite test.
Yeah. And you wouldn't expect it to be almost like a battlefield, a person in a battlefield. It's almost like, it told a completely different story.
Yeah.
Uh, right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, that's the thing about it. It was actually a part of this story, but it was just one part of the story. Like this is a 20-hour game almost, and
Yeah,
this particular scene, it's I think the most emotional, the most gripping scene of the whole thing.
yeah,
But we just didn't feel it that way when we were going into it.
yeah,
Uh, Hindsight 2020, it's kind of obvious. Oh, of course this was amazing. I mean,
yeah,
um, but that's not how that story unfolded.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
we discovered it through testing. We discovered it because one person said something. The rest of us said, "Oh, this is horrible," and then it was, "Wait a minute, it costs nothing to test.
Yeah,
This is," and even if we're completely wrong, the cost of failure is super low. It's 400 people, 500 people, maybe 1,000 people who will see it and make a different choice.
yeah,
The cost of it is super low,
yeah,
even if we're wrong. And if we're right, we improve everything. And of course, then we go apologize to the guy who got it right by
yeah,
buying some coffee. So that was what was at stake. And I think that's one of my favorite things about this, that the system
yeah,
is fairly easy to deploy and redeploy and test and retest.
yeah, yeah. For every unique idea or test that you run that's a winner like that, I imagine there are a lot of ideas that can be somewhat obvious, like let's test a red button versus a green button,
Right.
uh, or it just may not move the needle. Even if you think it's going to be amazing, it probably wouldn't move the needle or wouldn't to control, right? Uh, how do you recommend teams go about generating ideas for these tests, right? Which are sort of somewhat similar but have an interesting twist to them, or any other way you want to think about these.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is really the process because you never
Yeah,
know which one is the big idea.
yeah,
Red button, green button, fair enough. For what it's worth, I think that's also worth testing. But I mean, the icon is the size of a postage stamp.
yeah,
So maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
yeah.
Call to actions usually do make a difference when you're looking at much larger web pages, when you're looking at long copy. It
Hmm.
we see that it makes a difference. But I think what ends up happening is if you're sticking with a product and you're waiting for that one giant amazing idea
Hmm.
where okay, this is going to make your career as creative director or this is going to make your career as a performance marketer, then you're going to be waiting a long time. That's
Yeah,
my general feeling on that.
yeah.
I think experimentation needs cadence. Like we
Hmm.
did a couple of hundred tests on this, but of course, all the great companies in the world run dozens of tests practically every day.
Hmm.
And the way to really approach it is systematic. It's to see what is the cadence rather than what is the big idea.
Hmm.
Because once you get in the rhythm of it, once any team gets in the rhythm of it, you
Hmm.
get better at it,
Yeah,
right? Because I think even if you start at red button, green button, sometimes you got to see the fact that nobody actually cares to get that out
yeah,
of your system and to stop thinking about things that way. Because maybe
yeah,
it works for your app, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I've seen, you know, I've seen crazy things that I thought were as different as, ice and fire make no difference at all because the users don't necessarily care about the same things
Yeah,
that we care about, and we've just been wrong about that. And
yeah,
um, if I was to, for example, invest 6 months in making two things very, very different and then testing it and then finding out that the users actually don't care and one is 51.2% and the other one is 51.1%, yeah, I mean, that would be terrible. I
yeah,
think like for what it's worth, whether it's in this kind of testing or another kind of testing, 2 out of 3 experiments end up with a result of no difference. Like
Yeah.
even if you think that we're making two things that are completely different, quite often the audience just doesn't care what we care about.
Yeah.
Um, and then, and you know this was the same thing when we were working together. The thing that we hate the most, or the thing that we go, that's
Yeah.
definitely not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
Somehow the universe just wants to prove you wrong. It just goes and
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
get an insane result out of that, or that one lone voice that says
Yeah.
this is completely different,
Yeah.
and that ends up working. And then I think the other thing with testing, cadence being more important than the actual tests themselves, is that this is a great way to build a creative team, because
Yeah.
any good creative team has people who fundamentally believe in what they're doing. Like these are
Yeah.
folks who have done this for a while. They've been right a whole bunch of times. So how do they convince each other, and how do they gain this respect for each other if they're all
Mhm.
completely new and haven't worked together before?
Mhm.
I think having a cadence of testing where everybody can see that a whole bunch of people are right a whole bunch of times and a whole bunch of and wrong a whole bunch of times, it just lowers the ego threshold of being right and
Right.
being wrong,
Right.
and puts the focus on doing things that are meaningful.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you do enough red button, green button tests that have no impact. You do 10 of those, uh, and then no one's going to come up with the next idea of, oh, no, let's try purple button,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Everyone starts then thinking in different directions and in different ways, and then you end up
Yeah.
getting better ideas.
Yeah.
And then I think that that's in many ways more the most valuable thing.
Yeah. And when you say the cadence matters the most, what does that cadence look like? What does that process look like for you guys? Like, is there, I mean, who's present? Who's involved? Is there a
Well,
meeting? What is that like? Yeah.
well, typically the people who are most involved are the growth team, and I've now moved more towards the monetization side of things, so I don't really um, look at it in that way anymore. But certainly the growth team is involved and the studio is involved. Like whoever is making the app and whoever is selling the app.
Hmm.
And my typical rule for any of these things is bring in everybody who needs to be there, but don't bring in anybody who doesn't need to be there.
Okay.
Uh, so, like if it's an in-house system that you're setting up and you need a BI person to set it up, then definitely involve them. But if it's just something that you're testing on the Google Play Store and it's between the studios that make the art and the advertising or the growth team that runs the test, then run the test. And some folks
Hmm.
have a system where the studios run the test themselves because they have everything within
Hmm.
themselves.
Hmm.
They're fully they have the bandwidth, let's say. Then
Sure.
it's them, and other studios don't have that bandwidth, and it just is their advertising folks or their agencies or their growth teams that do it. Then it's just internally within their growth teams.
Hmm.
But in terms of cadence, I think that for most B2C, you got to give that at least 7 days.
Hmm.
And, in that way, if you're running 50 tests in one segment for one feature for one app, that's pretty decent. It's not perfect, but it's decent. And then you could also split between the US and UK or markets that for you behave the same way.
Hmm.
You could probably cluster them out and run a few tests in parallel. Um, but I would give it about 7 to 8 days. Sometimes you get a result sooner, and that's great. Sometimes you don't. But I would stop running a test after a week if it has no result, because I mean you could wait forever. And we have done a bit of analysis on how long is it, and the overwhelming majority of our tests we have a result in 8 days. And if we don't get a result in 7 to 8 days, then waiting 40 days doesn't give us anything useful.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So if you're getting results roughly in just over a week, you're structuring your meetings perhaps every other week or perhaps even every week to decide on what to
Yeah,
do
about every
next.
week. About every week. I mean,
Yeah.
any studio that I've advised in the past, and GameHouse works with a number of studios or worked with a number of studios really. Um, at least once a week, we'd report in on a bunch of experiments, whether it's on the product side,
Yeah.
particularly on the paid advertising side, or growth in general, and even on the CRM side. I imagine it's the same for all the good agencies out there as well. I know that you do something very similar,
Yeah.
where once a week you just kind of touch base, because that's how most
Yeah.
users look at the apps. I mean, people live week
Yeah.
to week.
Yeah.
Behaviors
Yeah.
on Sundays are different from Thursdays and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that that works here in the most optimal way as well.
Cool. Yeah. And you did say that earlier how a lot of the testing infrastructure on Google Play is very robust. So how do you recommend approaching iOS, if at all? Yeah, you know,
Yeah, this is a tough one to give a scientific answer on, because I think the it depends on who you ask, really. Like, I mean, there are companies who will tell you that their results on iOS are totally different from the results on Google, and that might be the case for them. Um, Typically, in my experience, at least in the US, I don't see a huge difference between something that is a killer creative on Google being a total dud on iOS. Having said that, everyone's got to test this thing out for themselves, because maybe a proxy landing page is better for somebody on iTunes,
mhm,
and maybe just importing Google results to iTunes is better. But what I can say is, once you run this experiment once or twice or even thrice, you'll have your answer. If you have a great killer result on Google and you deploy it on Apple and you don't see a bounce, you know that your Apple is different from your Google. If
right.
you see the same kind of killer bounce on iOS, you know that you can disregard um, a couple of blog posts out there that say it's completely different, and that for
Yeah.
you it's actually pretty similar.
Yeah.
And I've seen both happen, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's different for everybody. Maybe there's a broad trend that works for somebody in certain segments. I think the only way to do is test. So test, and if it has
Yeah.
no impact, then yeah, unfortunately, it has no impact.
Yeah.
Um, the
Yeah.
cost
Yeah.
for experimentation on iTunes is certainly higher in terms of dev costs, and then you're submitting, and then you're
Yeah.
waiting. So there's a lot of wastage in and around that.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Someday Apple's going to fix that,
Yeah. Or not.
or not. You never know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
have their reasons for doing what they do.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, that's
Yeah.
inevitable. And then some people don't have a philosophical issue with adding one more layer to the funnel in for the sake of testing.
Yeah.
I have issues with that, so I don't typically use those types of things. But that's just me. Uh,
Right.
if it works better to test, then it works better to test.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
I don't test separately. I do deploy to iTunes, because I found for the most part a giant win on Google for our segments of casual titles does translate into a good win on Apple as well.
Gotcha. And what metrics and or KPIs do you use to evaluate the results on Google Play when you're running these A/B tests?
I like looking at returned users,
Yeah.
especially for icons and headers and even copy and those types of things. I like using those. I prefer the retained user than just the installed user,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes those are different.
Mm-hmm.
Certain icons can be clickbaity, certain creatives and lines can be clickbaity, so you end up losing more people
Mm-hmm.
after a day. Um, and then when it comes to other things like conversion testing or onboarding testing, there Google Play has a much more robust window of 7 days and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would rather stick with something like that, like a 7 day look back, rather than an install look back.
Right. So for people who aren't familiar, this looks at the users who are retained after 7 days of install,
Exactly. Yep.
right? Which is a good
So
measure of whether they're staying in the app.
exactly, and I find that some of the shorthand that we use is perhaps almost confusing on purpose. Like
Yeah.
something like D7, and you see that in a report or a post, and you're like, what is that? And I think that that's a fair point. So if
Yeah.
someone downloads on a Monday because you changed something, you want to
Right.
see if they stick around for another week after that. Do they come back the next Monday?
Yeah.
Even now, like when I meet certain folks, and I told them, day 7 retention benchmark of 20% is a good number. Quite often there's a lot of double takes involved. Going, you can actually live with that you have 100 people installing on Monday, and only if you get, even if you get only 20 of those people coming back next Monday, in the consumer segment, you actually have a good app.
Yeah.
You actually have more than a good app. You have a pretty solid app at that point.
Indeed.
But yeah, that's just the benchmark. That's how the metrics work.
Indeed. Yeah, Sharath, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, I think this has been great, picking your brain on so many of the things you've learned, some of the interesting, non-obvious things you've learned running 200 plus tests. Thank you for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely, sir. Cool.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketshiphq.com/blog. Thank you.